All right, welcome to the Week 12 Forum. This week we are talking about the public and its beliefs. This is again chapter 11 of the Rosati and Scott text. And I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of contextualizing foreign policy as it relates to public opinion, because the two, again, I think I mentioned in the overview, they don't necessarily naturally align with one another. For a very long time, especially American political elites have viewed public opinion as irrelevant to what they do, largely again because, as I've mentioned, I think before in lectures and elsewhere, for much of the 19th, or certainly all of the 18th and much of the 19th century, to the extent that we were an independent country, people practicing foreign policy just basically thought, this is an area for the political elites of the country, and this is something that commoners or ordinary people didn't really have any interest in. And when that begins to change, people began paying a lot closer attention to foreign policy. Now, it really kind of begins with the Civil War, because that's really when you get the establishment of a media institution. There was already newspapers, but the newspapers really become institutionalized with the Civil War. You get the rise of, Newspaper Row in New York City, and you get, just these huge mass circulation, newspapers that emerge in that period. I'm not saying that that's really when the political elites began paying closer attention, but it's also a period of time. Remember those dailies, the emergence of dailies, showing the casualty figures during the Civil War. That begins to routinize people to the news in a certain way. Now, that means you still have decades going along. It's really World War II, really, Spanish American War, World War I. All of these, these are events that kind of, again, they blow up. People pay close attention to them, and then they're done, and people go back to not paying attention to foreign policy. That begins to change at the end of World War II, and again, one of the factors that is really important for understanding that is the rise of the Cold War. The Cold War really begins to get people thinking in terms of foreign policy as a durable, matter of interest. And then, of course, you get Vietnam and the long-standing problems there. You get the division between the liberals and conservatives in terms of how to conduct, the Vietnam conflict. And then you get really kind of a schism, an ideological dividing point between liberals and conservatives as a result of Vietnam. So one of the questions that is in the discussion questions is, why is public opinion on international affairs so volatile? And the reason is typically because most Americans still are not particularly that well educated on foreign policy and on international affairs. And keep in mind, people that have set opinion, you ask me my opinion on any political issue, it's going to be the result of me thinking about it over decades. I've been a political animal since I was in my early 20s. My viewpoints are not just going to be all over the place. But people that don't have a deep knowledge base on an issue, those are the folks that 1 minute they'll think this, and then they'll get information, and that will cause them to change their minds. It's easiest to change people's minds when their information level is low, and that explains why opinion shifts so radically from one side to the next when it comes to foreign affairs. Because again, in a lot of instances, what are the issues that are driving people's, the public's viewpoint on an issue? It's either a matter of war, or it's some kind of disaster. And in that instance, it falls down to help or not help, bomb or don't bomb, and so that tends to affect the way people perceive things. Another issue we can talk about just briefly is this idea of George Herbert Walker Bush. And this was a guy who at the end of the Persian Gulf War had an approval rating at 90%. But he did not win re-election 2 years later. What happened to cause that to happen? And again, the answer has something to do with the fact that George Herbert Walker Bush was primarily a foreign policy president. So he was committing a lot of time and effort to doing things that the public wasn't paying attention to. And when it came time for him to be reelected, there was there was a significant subset within the Republican electorate that was basically saying, well, that guy raised taxes. He can't be any good, right? And that really spelled his doom to a large extent. Okay. Um, we talk about the impact of the Vietnam War and how it affected, public opinion on foreign policy. We can talk a lot about the emergence of neoconservatism. All of these are kind of interesting issues. If you want to talk about coronavirus, the COVID crisis right now, I think that's an issue that increasingly is going to have a significant impact in terms of foreign policy, not just what's happening within this country, but how our relationships with other countries are going to be affected. So all of these are really, really good, good things to talk about. So let's have a great week of discussion, and let's stay safe.